Next up, I want to talk a little bit about how Ansible reaches out to our various hosts and configures them. How does it get its code out there to execute to set up an environment however you specify? How does it even inspect the state of a given environment and then reverse that into what actions are going to be necessary to run that it then has to run? So how does it then run those actions against that host? Well, that's what this module is going to be about, is talking about SSH, but also alternatives for connecting to hosts with Ansible. And if I haven't beaten the dead horse yet, we have the ansible-doc command up here on the screen again, and that's because we can take a look at the type here of what. What do you think I'm going to put in here next? I know this is kind of ambiguous, but tell me what I should type here next with regards to the context of the content of this module of the course. In this case, I want to look at connection plugins. I want to list those out and just take a look at how we can connect to various different environments with Ansible. And wow, there's quite a few here, and these are all out of the box. And don't forget, we can always add to this list of plugins by installing extra plugins. We could create those plugins ourselves, or we could get those plugins from somebody else. For now, focus on what's available out of the box. And I think if you look through this list, you'll see some things here that should look familiar. We have, for example, the local plugin, which allows us to execute something on the controller itself. So to basically have a single machine that configures itself, which I think is a great way to learn about Ansible. High reward opportunity to use Ansible to configure your developer workstation or your personal workstation. Another one that sticks out to me, SSH. That's a protocol that's used by default with Ansible to connect out to various different nodes. But notice that we also have things like WinRM as a plugin that helps us manage Windows machines via WinRM. Keep scrolling through this list here. You'll see things like Cube Control, which allows you to execute tasks that are going to be run inside of pods inside of Kubernetes. And maybe one last of the connection plugins is Docker, perhaps my favorite. I think it's a lot of fun because when I first saw this, I had the aha moment, because I know there is a subcommand that I'm not going to give away quite yet that allows you to get inside of a running container and tinker around with it. And I was like, you know what? I bet Ansible uses that subcommand to get in there and do things. And you know what? I was right. And that feeling was great. Really helped solidify my understanding of how Ansible works. So maybe look through this list here for something that you really know really well and see if you can guess how Ansible uses this as a connection means or a protocol, and then go look at the source code for Ansible and see if you are right. You might have that same aha moment and not even need to watch much more of this module and get everything that I intended out of it. So without saying much more, let's just dive into an example of using Docker in this module very briefly. A little bit like I just did, I'm going to go in the last module, but in a little bit more depth with more containers to show you some really neat things you can do with Ansible. Oh, and also showing you how these things called connection plugins work, or at least getting the concept across. That's what we like to call a 2-for-1. Let's just say you are in for a treat. Now, to understand how we might use a Docker environment, I want to back up to our simple example of copying a git config file, or copying any file really, and back up to that master git config file that we had on our control node that we then use to configure our control node, which happens to be Mac OS. And that actually was localhost, so we were really just copying a file to our local computer. We've already covered that, but the reason I want to back up to that is because that has to lead you to wonder how exactly does that connection happen. And so you could learn more about that by opening up the plugin for what? Well, if I hop out to the source code for Ansible, hit the T key and start searching for files, and I'm going to put local.py in. Quick hint is to take the name of the plugin and just throw .py on the end, and you'll probably find it inside of the core of Ansible if it came with Ansible out of the box. And take a look at that right at the top of the list. Now, be careful when you're looking through this list here that you don't grab the wrong thing. There are quite a few different results that come up, and one that I oftentimes see that can be confusing is the set of tests that are involved in testing out a plugin with Ansible. To avoid those, look for what's inside of lib and click on, in this case, our local.py file, and we can see how the local connection works. If you want to, you can read through here and learn that we're just going to run a command right here on our local computer. And how do we do it? Well, I don't know. Maybe take some time and read through this file and figure it out. That's a nice exercise to do on your own. For now, I want to come back to those slides I had. So we were using our local connection plugin type to configure our control node, and we did that, hint, hint, with a shell running on our control node. So if we could just open a shell or SSH to a remote node, well, another connection type then could be something to do with Docker containers. Let's say we have Docker containers running on our control node. We want to configure those. Well, we would just need to reach out via Docker protocols and run commands on those Docker containers. And that may not be something that you would normally do, especially configuring Git inside of them. But let's just pretend for a second here. Let's pretend that we want to configure these, and the reason I say that is because they are great learning tools for quickly spinning up and down environments with Ansible and Docker specifically, versus maybe, say, Vagrant with VMs, which, albeit are very fast, they're not quite as fast as containers happen to be today. And so that's why this excites me, and I wanted to try out this example, because we can quickly spin up and spin down environments, throw them away, and create new ones more or less whenever we want, and really, really fast, which is much more helpful than having just a control node that is configured however it is configured. I mean, there are settings I have on my machine right now that are influencing how my machine is configurable. And they are settings that perhaps I've set years ago, and maybe I don't even remember them anymore, and they obviously are affecting my demonstrations. But if I were to create from an image a Docker container, I have a new starting point, just like with a VM, to make sure that we have that common starting point and reproducibility when it comes to using Ansible, specifically with Ansible's playbooks. Now, with regards to Docker, the neat thing is the Docker connection type could easily be connecting to containers running on our control node or containers running on some sort of external node. It doesn't have to be a specific node. It could be a cluster even. So the sky's the limit. And you can imagine then if you're using the Docker protocols to communicate with these containers and execute commands inside of them, that you could do a lot of really neat things when it comes to Ansible and merge the two technologies to get a lot of mileage out of both of them. And so let's look at using the Docker connection plugin type in this module of the course. And to simplify things, we will be just running some containers on our local machine. But to do something really cool, I'll show you how you can create those containers with Ansible, because why not, right? We're using Ansible and it can create containers for us too. And then once we've created those, we can go ahead then and configure them. All right, so if you look in the course repo, you will find a folder called Connecting. And I've already put together a set of example files, so you don't have to spend a lot of time building these up. We want to focus on different types of connections. And in this example, we're going to look at the Docker connection plugin. So first up, if you want to learn more about this, you could run ansible-doc and pass the type of connection, pass in Docker, and get the documentation for the Docker connection plugin, just like you could get for any other connection type or plugin for Ansible. So with that in mind, back to the files here for the example. We will first look at that Ansible config file. If I just dump out the contents of that, you can see we are simply pointing at an inventory file, dumping out the contents of the inventory file called connecting hosts. We simply have a grouping of containers, Docker containers is what I'm thinking. And inside of that grouping, we are creating 3 separate containers. This syntax is to denote a range of hosts. So I'm creating Ansible container test 1, 2, and 3. And note that they're going to use the Ansible_connection set to Docker. So this is how we specify which of the plugins that we use to connect to a given host. In this case, these are Docker containers. All right, so if we look at our files here, I have two separate playbooks. We have create container and cleanup. Create container has everything to do with spinning up those three containers through to configuring Git. And then cleanup has everything to do with removing them. So let's go ahead and open this up in Visual Studio Code to look at the playbooks. So the very first play involves installing a prerequisite that is required for the Docker container module. That's going to be used next. So I put that up at the top just so you can see what that would look like if you wanted to try to install a pip package inside of a playbook. I already have this installed, so it's not going to be necessary on my system. If I do a pip3 list here, you'll see there is the Docker package already installed. So I don't have to actually install that, but that is a prereq. And I know that because, well, there's a section inside of ansible-doc. If I put in docker_container, that's a module for creating and managing Docker containers. There is a section for requirements. And inside of here, you'll be able to see that we need the Docker package available to us, which you can install with pip. By the way, this Docker package used to be called docker-py, might cause some confusion. If you're curious about using Docker with Ansible, just know that docker-py was renamed to just Docker, and older versions of Python might have needed the docker-py package. So anyways, requirements are part of the documentation for modules. And if I come back to the code for this example, you'll see the heart of this is ensuring that we create our Docker containers. We have three of them that are going to create. I'm not going to get into a lot of the syntax here. This is more of an advanced topic, but I wanted to give you something to chew on, to maybe run with and play around with a little bit. So I'm going to connect to localhost, which is where my Docker container host is running at. So you'll need to have Docker installed to follow along for this. You look at the top here, my status bar, you can see I have Docker up and running, Docker desktop for Mac. And then I have one task here that uses the Docker container module, and it uses the Python image to spin up a container. So you have to know a lot about containers in Docker. Think of an image as a vagrant box. It's the baseline set of files or file system that creates our container. So this means that we have a file system that contains Python installed. You can look at Docker Hub for images if you're curious about other tools you might want installed, but obviously Python is going to be a tool of interest given that we're working with Ansible. Continuing on, this module has other arguments that I've set up for this to be interactive. There's a way to keep it running in the background. This works by keeping standard in open after the container is launched, and I am also starting a container based on the Python image, which will run the Python REPL, and so that will be pending input from the user and just sit there open indefinitely. I am then going to name this container. The name of it is going to match item. This is a variable. This is going to be set based on a loop that I've created down below. Again, not going to get into the advanced aspects of this, but I am essentially querying my inventory so that I don't have to duplicate the information. This is going to go read that inventory file, or read the inventory actually that we have, and look at our host names, specifically look at the containers group only. So if we look at our inventory again, you can see that we will look at the containers group only and pull back those three container names of Ansible container test 1, 2, and 3. So we're going to pull those three containers, and for each of those, we are going to create the container. That's what we're basically doing here. So just ensure that the Docker container is started for each of those given containers. And then I've commented out the code down below to configure Git. It just happens to be that the Python image comes with Git installed in it, so we can do this in a moment. I wanted to first create the containers, show you that they're working, and then we can go about configuring Git to see that that works as well, just like with a VM. Now, there are plenty of other Docker container module arguments that you could be passing. There are a ton, actually, just like the Docker CLI has. In fact, if you're familiar with Docker, you can think of the Docker container module as a lot like working with the Docker CLI in a more idempotent fashion. Note that there is a state argument that I've set to started, so I want my container to be up and running. I might also decide that I want to set the command for the container to something else besides Python if I want it to be running bash, for example, in the background. Doesn't really matter for this example. I just want some containers running in the background. That's all I've set up here. With that understanding, let's hop over to the command line, and I will show you that I have no containers running right now. You don't have to be an expert at Docker to understand that the output here shows nothing. I've basically dumped everything there could possibly be for containers, including stopped containers, and there is nothing on my machine right now. So if I now run the playbook to create the containers, remember we've commented out the code to configure Git, so we won't hit those tasks. We won't hit that entire play, actually. It's that fast to create 3 separate containers, Ansible container test 1, 2, and 3. And now if I run my DCPSA, which is my alias to just run a dump of my containers that are running on my system, you can see I've got 3 containers up and running, and I continue to query this to see that they are still up and running. If I run my playbook again, nothing will happen because I've already created the container, so there's nothing to do. That's a beautiful thing about idempotence. So in a lot of ways, what I have here with Docker_container, while it is mirroring the Docker CLI, it's more like Docker Compose, if you're familiar with that, where it's going to help you make sure that a set of containers are in a given state. Okay, so next clip, let's go ahead and configure Git. Okay, so we have our containers created. I'm just going to wipe out the screen here, and I'm going to play around with a tool that we learned a little bit about in the last module, which was the ansible-console command, because it's a lot of fun. I'm going to start it up and point it at the containers grouping of hosts, which will be our 3 containers. You can see I actually have 3 hosts that I'm pointed at, and Ansible actually runs in parallel. It'll run up to 5 at a time as far as configuring 5 separate environments or hosts, or in this case, containers at a time. You can configure that aspect, but it's by default 5. None of that's really important though, because all we want to do here with Ansible-console is to use our REPL to have a little bit of fun. So why don't we run the git config module and use list all to dump out our configuration, and we'll set the scope here to just global configuration for Git. And you'll see in a moment here, there we go. We have 3 results that come back for our 3 separate containers. Pretty cool, right? Look, Ansible container test 2 and then test 1. And notice these are not in the exact order that you might expect. If you thought they might come back 1, 2, 3, well, that might be how I define the range in the inventory file, but that doesn't mean that that's how Ansible is going to connect to them. So we're going to get results back when we get results back, and then we're going to dump that information. So these may not be in the same order every time. So if I run this again, so we get 2, 1, 3 again. Oh, and some of the warnings in Ansible will only print the first time as well. So sometimes it's nice to run this subsequently if you don't want all that verbosity of the warnings and you don't want to go about the process of configuring those warnings not to show. Anyways, here we go. Here is our output. And yeah, you can see here we got 3, 1, 2 in this case, whereas we had 2, 1, 3 in this case, and up here we had, well, 2, 1, 3 in the first case as well. So there is some randomness to the ordering of the output here that is to be expected. Anyways, if you look at the config values section that comes back from our git config module from Ansible, you can see we have not configured Git for any of these containers. Of course, remember, we could do just about anything with these containers with the REPL here. If we wanted to, we could use that ping module, could run that against all of our containers, and we get our pong back from each of them. Sky's the limit. Try out some of the other modules on these containers. That is, after all, the point of having containers. Spin them up, spin them down, throw them away when you're done, and have great, clean learning environments. Okay, so I'm going to exit out of the REPL now. I can also show you that we do have the 3 containers still running on my system here for a little bit of time now. And if I clear that out, we can now come over to Visual Studio Code and uncomment these lines. This will configure Git for us automatically as a part of our playbook. So what we're going to do here is first, we will dump out our Git configuration before, the scope being global. We'll then set the email to my email address in the global scope, and then the name, and then we will dump out the entirety of the global configuration again afterwards. And remember, there's a very special flag we're going to need if we want to see that output of the list all option being passed to the git config module. Start thinking about that. So let's pop over to the command line, and you can help me out with that here in a second. We are going to run the Ansible Playbook command here.
pass our create container playbook, our playbook that has a newly added play that was commented out before, to configure Git. And now what flag do I want to pass here if I want to be able to see that list all output from the git config module? So make sure you add a -v on the end here and we can see a little bit of diagnostic information. This will take a little bit of time to run. You can see we don't have any configuration here. Now we have set one of the values and the other one, and now we are dumping out our configuration, and look at that. We've got our values set for email and name. Isn't that pretty darn cool? Of course, I could run this again. It wouldn't matter. Nothing's going to need to be changed in this case because we already have our configuration set. So there is nothing really to do but just loop through and make sure that nothing has changed, that nobody got into our containers and tweaked some of the Git configuration on us. In this case, everything was okay. 5 OKs. All right, that's how fast we can create containers. You can see them running here. If you wanted to, you could run a Docker container exec, sneak in the old-fashioned way, if you will, instead of using Ansible to look at all of these. And then we could connect up to our first test container here, maybe open up a bash process inside of this, and boom, we are in. And so now I can just run git config here, global scope, list out our configuration, bada bang, bada bang. There we go, we've got our configuration set. And of course we could do this with all of our containers. We could even come in with ansible-console if we wanted to after the fact and take a look at all of them as well. Sky's the limit, have fun with it, because now we're going to destroy all this in the same amount of time it took us to create it. All right, so we've got our containers still running here. If you want to clean things up, and I remember I did not tell you how to do that with Vagrant at the end of our Vagrant examples with VMs. So if you have VMs still running, make sure you go run Vagrant halt in that Vagrants folder. If you want to do the equivalent with our containers here, I've created a playbook to help you out. And let's just dump this out here right at the command line. It's not that long. It's called cleanup.yaml, and it's just got one play inside of it to ensure that all of our containers are gone. It's got one task that loops through our 3 containers. We could add more if we wanted to. That could be a challenge you could work on your own in the inventory file. We're querying that inventory host names for our containers grouping and pulling all those back here and then iterating over those. And we are executing the Docker container module this time to get rid of our containers. And so a couple of things here. First off, I've specified the name to be the item variable, which is just the value of the current result of our query. So it'll be Ansible container test 1, 2, 3, etc. I'm adding the force kill argument to speed up the process of getting rid of these. Otherwise, you will sit and twiddle your thumbs for a while because the Python REPL that's running in the background won't give up so easily if you just simply ask it to stop with state absent, which is the last part of this, is to remove the container. So we'd have to stop it first to do that, and normally that will take a little bit of time because it's going to fight you. I don't want to get into the reasons why, but adding that force kill flag makes this go really quickly. Okay, so I have the containers created here, and just to prove that they are up and running, I can dump them out. There's our 3 containers, and so now that I'm done with the example, I want to clean up. How do I do that? We just need to run the Ansible playbook command and pass along our cleanup playbook. Run that. Give it a few seconds. All of our containers should be wiped out. Wow, is that fast. That was real time right there. If I run the Docker container PS again, just to dump everything out, including stop containers, you can see there's absolutely nothing here. So these are gone from the system. We can start anew if we'd like to and run a whole new set of tests. Think about the power that this holds. So now that you've seen a demonstration of just another type of connection plugin, start to think about what is all possible with Ansible. The reason why we can just specify Docker and be up and running with Docker containers is because there is a plugin that exists inside of Ansible that understands how to communicate with Docker containers to reach out and copy files, for example, scripts that could be executed, or maybe files that you want for configuration, and then it can reach out and run that configuration for you. It understands the protocols to do that. Just like the default of SSH to run a command on a remote system or to copy some files to a remote system, we can do the same thing with Docker. We can also do the same thing with many of these other approaches. And I really would encourage you to look at least one more of these and start thinking about how it works and go do what I said, which is go dig under the covers and see if you can figure out how it works. When I was looking at the Docker connection plugin, the first thought I had was Docker container exec, just like I showed you a moment ago to get into one of our containers to look at the Git configuration manually. Not as fun as ansible-console. We can't hit all of our containers at once necessarily. Maybe we can write a script or something, but we still can do it the old-fashioned way of Docker container exec and get inside of this isolated container environment that is a great testing environment. And so in my head, I was like, oh, you know what? I bet Ansible uses Docker container exec to run commands inside the container. That's got to be part of what this Docker plugin does. And sure enough, that's exactly what's going on. How I confirmed it, I took a look at the Docker events that are running on my system. So I'll open that up in a tab. I'll split the window here and down below. Let me show you there is nothing in existence. So I'll go ahead and create my containers. Now just watch what happens up above. Look at that. We've got events firing off. So something is going on with Docker. And if you look up here, you'll see the word exec used quite often. That is pretty darn cool. So Docker container exec or the protocols behind Docker container exec are being used to configure our containers to reach out and execute whatever it is that we see fit. So this is how I reverse engineer this process. Of course, I could go just look at the source code and see how it works and probably find the same thing. But sometimes it's fun to run little experiments and see if you can guess at it and then test your guesses before you even look at the source code to see what's going on behind the scenes. Before I move on, I see one more thing on the screen up above that indicates how some of this process of configuring our containers is working. Can you find it? I'll give you a few seconds and I'll show you. So I just noticed that I saw the word git config up above a few times. So there you can see over the Docker exec tunnel, if you will, or connection plugin, we are sending our command to configure Git in this case. But it could be any one of those hundreds or thousands of core modules or even community modules that we are executing over this plugin or tunnel that is using Docker exec under the hood. In our case, it just happens to be Git configuration. So pick one of those other plugin types that you're familiar with and see if you can not only figure out how it works, but also how you could test it without looking at the Ansible source. That would be a really, really powerful learning technique because to do that requires a very advanced understanding of not only Ansible, but these other tools that are involved. And that will really help drill into your memory permanently what these connection plugins do. And don't forget, we've also seen the local connection plugin implicitly with that local host that's been there the whole time throughout this whole course, or that we defined explicitly. So we've already seen some of these other ways of communicating with environments. Now, one more aspect of connecting, if you will, is to turn on its head the entire notion that we've talked about in this course of Ansible reaching out to these other nodes, sending out commands or files, and then executing those files or commands, and then getting results back. Turning that on its head, that push model into a pull model. And that's what the ansible-pull command does. With ansible-pull, on the other hand, we still have our managed nodes, but we no longer have a control node. Instead, we have just our version controller repository. And inside of there is a playbook. I like to refer to the nodes now as self-managed nodes because on each of them, there's some sort of cron job that runs that will clone down the repo to get the latest changes of the playbook. The playbook will be handed off to Ansible that will turn around and configure the self-managed node. And thus Ansible is running on each self-managed node instead of on a control node in a decentralized fashion, and thus a pull model. And of course, cron can run at any pace, and each of the self-managed nodes, if you will pull down the playbook and execute Ansible as it sees fit on its own schedule. And so that's the distinction in the two models. We have push versus pull. So if that's what you would like to do, and I think it's actually a great learning tool, this is also a great model for scalability. Spend some time and play around with this. It's really easy. It's a really neat way to learn about Ansible as well, because you can just check in code to Git, and then you can use ansible-pull to execute it and wrap your mind around yet again another concept in Ansible. And so just to make clear, this is a command that is available to you. So ansible-pull is available right here at the command line. You can get the help for that if you want, instead of looking at the website documentation.